Okay, I think we are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the Gutman Library Book Talk for Sanctuary School, Innovating to Empower Immigrant Youth. My name is Shannon Davis, and I'm Senior Acquisitions Editor at Harvard Education Press. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Chandler Patton Miranda, author of Sanctuary School, which just published by Harvard Education Press this past Wednesday. Dr. Miranda is an assistant professor of education at Malloy University. Her research focuses on urban immigrant education in the U.S. context as it relates to school leadership, institutional culture, and the politics of language learning. Her most recent work appears in Harvard Educational Review, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, Leadership and Policy in Schools, and Equity and Excellence in Education. She is a former high school science teacher, and Sanctuary School is her first book. Chandler, thank you for being here today. It is also an honor to introduce our moderator for today's book talk. Please welcome Wilmer Chavarria, Superintendent of the Winooski School District, leading the only minority-majority district in the state of Vermont and modeling practices that affirm, protect, and capitalize on the diversity of the district's students, families, and staff. The Winooski School District is the first and only district in the state to officially designate itself as a sanctuary district for immigrant students. Welcome, Wilmer, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And thank you, Gutman Library for hosting the book talk. So we'll listen to your conversation and then reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A from our viewers. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Chandler and Wilmer.
All right. Thank you so much, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation that is right now more important than ever. And it's my pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. Patton Miranda today. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I know as a superintendent right now, you must be very busy, so I'm thrilled that we get to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to see you and to hear you today. We have been in contact quite a bit in writing, but it's really nice to actually be having a conversation in person. So I'm really happy about this opportunity. All right, why don't we get right to it? I would love to hear more about who you are, both as a person, as an advocate, but also as an author, and eventually how that connects to the book that we're talking about today.
Sure, absolutely. So I came to this work in kind of a roundabout way, and I came to teaching in kind of a roundabout way. After college, I taught in San Benito, Texas for 2 years at a ninth grade center where I taught ninth grade physics and remedial biology. And then I moved to Barranquilla, Colombia, where I taught AP physics for 2 years, and finally finished my classroom career in Bogota teaching ninth grade biology. And what was really interesting to me is that on paper, all of my students were quote unquote English language learners, right? All of them would be considered Spanish dominant, and most of them were in different phases of learning English. And all of them would have been considered Latino or Hispanic on a lot of the school data forms. But their lived experience with schools were quite different based on their level of privilege and home country, and then also how they were choosing to use the US education system. So I had students in San Benito who would cross the border every day for school, or who lived in unincorporated colonias, or some who were ranch owners who had lived in the same place for generations, even as the border had moved. And in Colombia, I had students who were children of presidents who would cross the border to come to elite universities and colleges in the US and in the Northeast. And many of them were offered full scholarship because it didn't really matter if it was a student from San Benito or a student from Barranquilla, Colombia. They were all check boxes for USA Today kind of ranking systems. And so when I came back to NYU for my PhD, I was very interested in transmigration, crossing borders for educational purposes, and trying to understand that process a little bit better and how privilege played into that process. And so when I got to NYU, I started taking classes and doing some of my coursework around this question of movement across borders for educational purposes. And I discovered the Internationals network of public schools were in New York City, and they were basically offering what seemed like the kind of education my Colombian students were getting, a very kind of thing, boutique kind of education, right? A small school, personalized instruction, project-based learning, portfolio assessment, treated like whole important human beings. And comparatively in the US, kids who were newest to the country, who were learning English, that wasn't the treatment that they were getting. There's decades of literature, including Angela Valenzuela's subtractive schooling, which I kind of wrote this book to be a foil to, talking about the isolation and segregation of English learners in schools, and really just even like the diminishment of children and teenagers to this status of English learner in schools. And so the more I learned about the schools, the more I spent time in these schools, the more I knew that they were doing something different. They had like a special sauce. And as a educational anthropologist, I really wanted to know more. I wasn't the first person to study internationals, but I came to internationals at a really unique time. I moved to the United States from Bogota in 2014. This was a time in which there were lots of unaccompanied minors crossing the border. And I started my study in September 2016, intending to kind of focus on portfolio assessment and project-based learning and how that changes the dynamics for English learners in a school or multilingual learners in a school. But then the 2016 election happened, and I let the field kind of guide me to what has now eventually become this book.
Yeah, it seems like many of us in the world of education we had our plans, but the politics of the time had other plans for us. So let's jump into some of that right now. Before we get to the Internationals network and that as a model for much of the content of your book, some of our audience members or your readers and people with us today might be coming here because they may be educators themselves, or people that would just want to know, maybe at a higher level, what do we mean by sanctuary school? That's the title of the book, but it's a word. Sanctuary is a word that has been out there quite a bit, normally in a bad light, in a threatening light. So can you just tell us at a higher level what you mean by sanctuary, and then what you mean by sanctuary school?
Yes. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons I insisted on a title that included the word sanctuary, was because as I was doing my research, so this is 2016, there were about 6 cities who were identified as sanctuary municipalities at that time. In 2017, that number exploded to something like 600. And in those cities, universities and schools were using that same language to describe their positionality around the topic of immigration. Sometimes this was in the way that they did school policy. Sometimes it was in school board resolutions. But the word sanctuary was out there, and it was being used to describe schools and districts that were trying to signal to their immigrant communities that they were supporting them, that they were safe there, that they could continue to come to school, because as you probably many of you remember, attendance rates, particularly in immigrant districts, dropped off considerably at that time. And when I read these resolutions, when I read the articles about them in the newspaper, when I looked at them closely, so many of them had to do with important things like keeping student data safe and keeping ICE off campus, or what to do if ICE shows up on campus. Those are absolutely baselines for sanctuary. But what I was seeing at International High School went so far beyond that in terms of its understanding of sanctuary that I felt like we needed a different definition, that we needed a different orientation to the word that really allowed to go beyond protective stances or beyond kind of even acute reactions to the socio-political movement, and think about protection more broadly. What does it mean when a kid walks into the school and it's the first school that they've come to in the United States? How do we welcome them? How do we receive them? Is it to sit them down, give them a home language survey, and send them to the basement class to start learning cat and dog? Or is it a full welcoming into the school in which they are positioned to be successful and be welcome members of those community? And then even at the end of school, are we protecting children's childhood? Are we protecting their ability to stay in school as long as possible, to learn the things they need to go on to live full and meaningful lives? Or are we saying it's not worth it for you to enroll here? You're never going to finish, so go out into the world and be an adult. So really, I wanted to write this book so teachers and educators broadly and school leaders could think more profoundly and a little bit more broadly about, one, the idea of protection, and then what it looks like to move beyond protection, to think about the adults in the school, to think about school design, to think about what it really means to stand up for your students.
Yes.
Move beyond kind of the silence or the don't ask, don't tell about status that we have right now.
Yes, and for our audience and for the readers, you have some very specific and concrete ways in which you can do that in your book. So I highly recommend people reading the book, because you go into detail about what you mean by that, and you use some very good examples on how that's been actually possible in real life. And I will say it to the concept of protection. Before you published your book, and uh, uh, before the launching of the book this week, months ago, our district had a framework for our sanctuary, what we mean by sanctuary, and the framework was pause involved. So I thought it was very interesting in the way you conceptualize sanctuary to use the word protect, but subdivide the concept, but also separate it from another. I would say that in our experience as a school district, we've used that word protection to actually describe much of what you use to say, let's go beyond protection, right? So, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a little bit, because I want to first linger on the word sanctuary. When I was reading your book, I felt very validated, because when we became the first school district to officially designate ourselves as a sanctuary district, um, a lot of people were saying, why don't you just settle for something that's not going to call attention on you? Something that's not going to call attention on communities that are already afraid. And the word is just too explosive. It can, and I said, then might as well just not do anything if we're just going to hide from it, or if you're just going to do the right thing, but do it quietly. I'm not sure that this is a strategy that this moment needs. And your book makes much of a case for that. So I'd love to hear more about that from you.
Yeah, I mean, so I keep finding myself saying sanctuary school is not a place. It is a mindset and an orientation to education that is going to look different, a little different everywhere. And in the final chapter, I take up this debate of when and when not to use sanctuary. And I think that there are places in which it is going to be ineffective in accomplishing what you want to accomplish. There are places in which doing the work subversively is going to be the best methodological approach. I think in places where you have a little bit more protection, where you have a little bit more kind of buffering, hypothetically in sanctuary states and sanctuary municipalities, that using the word is a powerful contribution to signaling a movement, right? It's not just about signaling to families safety, but calling the school a safe zone, or calling the, the resolution something like a welcoming resolution for all students. It brushes so much of what we mean specifically for immigrant families under a rug. And I do think that when you can use sanctuary to describe what your school is doing, that it is absolutely worthwhile. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today about what that process looked like on the ground, what it felt like to have that debate, and why you ultimately chose to do it.
Yeah, well, I'll take that as a question, but I'll say, um, I think the decision making for us ultimately was based on the stories of our students in this moment, and the people right here in my office. I was meeting with people as young as 5 years old, 6 years old, who were being brought by a teacher saying, you know, they want to show you something, and what they wanted to show me was a story or a drawing about crossing the border and stuff like that. Then meeting in the same office with families who were not wanting to bring their kids to school because they were afraid of a separation. Sorry, my camera is doing things. A separation while their children are in school, and I had those stories, and that's how we framed at least the beginning of what should be a sense of urgency. And at least for this community and for this specific context, the word was the right one, and it continues to be. And then what we mean by the word, evolved through our debates and conversations, but we centered the story of the people that were right here and what the people needed. And so I actually want to send it back to you because some of those stories in your book felt so close to me and so close to this moment. And I think it would be wonderful for people who have not started reading the book yet, or maybe haven't gotten to some of that, to maybe hear one of those stories. And then we can move to how that illustrates some of the way you conceptualize the idea of sanctuary.
Sure, absolutely. So I think what I wanted more than anything for this book is for the stories to be highlighted, um, and to really lead the narrative, to help people make those connections to it. So I begin the book with the story of Milagros, who crossed the border alone. She was very frightened when she was detained by Border Patrol. She spent days in what a lot of people refer to as an ice box, because they're these detention centers that they're so cold, and they just have like the metallic blankets and things like that. And then ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, sent her to New York to live with an uncle, and that's how she came to International High School. Um, and so she arrived at school. She's a very small woman and wears thick glasses. And when I first met her, she had trouble kind of making eye contact. But she'd been at the school for 4 years at that point, and she had very close relationships with Luz, these are also pseudonyms, by the way. Luz, who I also write about in the book, and she was working on her graduation requirements. And so what I learned over the course of sitting with her and working with her on her essays over many, many months, was that when she'd come to this school, she had no winter clothes. She was in a household where she was experiencing abuse. Her border crossing journey was very traumatic, very scary, and it had been a crossing that another family member had not done successfully, who had disappeared in the process. And so Milagros, she was 20, I think 20 or 21 when I met her. She was 22 when she graduated. She had the profile of a child who in most cases wouldn't have been allowed to enroll in school. And because of her quiet personality, because she had stopped going to school in 5th grade in her home country, would have been pushed out or in the shadows in a traditional school. And instead, what she had were teachers who took up a fund and took her shopping for her winter clothes, who had helped her move into a shelter for women who've experienced domestic abuse, had helped her get legal aid so that she had a special juvenile visa status that eventually allowed her to get citizenship, that she had received high rigorous content that demonstrated to her that she could learn hard things, that she didn't need to be reading kindergarten level text, that she had a lot of knowledge to bring to hard conversations. For example, about one of her essays was on women's rights. And it was just such a stark contrast to what her experience, or what the documented experiences of children like her had were, that I thought it was a good way to start the conversation about what protection looks like, right? About what it looks like to come into a new school and to be fully taken care of. And again, she had this very close relationship with Luz. They're still close. Milagros has a master's degree in social work now. She graduated at 22 after 6 years and a little bit, and they had a ceremony for her. And she actually works as a social worker at the place where she went to live after she left her uncle's house. And so it was kind of this full circle moment for her when I saw her recently. But I also write about Luz, who had lived a very, not exactly the same, but similar experience as a 16-year-old moving from Colombia in the early 2000s. So Luz had attended one of the first international high school, the one that had opened in 1985 in New York City, had not finished in 4 years, had been kind of protected from adulthood by her mentors who asked her to stay another year and figure out what she wanted to do, who drove her to college, who outfitted her dorm room, who brought her back to student teach as a math teacher at the school. So there were just these longer stories of how this school created space for people and how the school was thinking about representation and the relationships that existed there. And I think that this is consequential. And Laura, who was the principal at the school, who I write about, she's the only named person in the book. And I can talk a little bit about that, why that decision was made post-election. But she pointed out to me just the other day, like none of the stories in the book are about the exceptional kids, right? And there were exceptional kids in the school, but these were the kids who would have had the labels overaged, long-term L, SLIFE, special education, who had trauma and mental health concerns. These were kids who demographically, statistically do not graduate in the United States. And yet there was this kind of generational story of love and care, and the result being graduation and living these full lives, still very much connected to the school community. And so I thought that was important to highlight.
I think of so thank you for establishing that story first, because a lot of that will connect to the theoretical part of things, and I'd love for us to hear a little bit about the protection and the innovation, and how those two ideas are related by differentiated under the umbrella of sanctuary. And then we can maybe connect it back to some of how that played out with the story for Luz, of course, but how that might be playing out in this moment for maybe schools that do not have the same capacity, context, even demographics, definitely resources. So, but let's talk about those two concepts first: protection and innovation.
Okay, so, and what it looked like in these cases.
Yes. Sorry, my internet must be struggling a little.
Yeah. So what I write about in terms of innovation, so I frame Milagros' story within the context of protection, right? How she was received, how she was cared for. But I argue that caring for her in this way would have not been possible without systems and structures in place in the school built over time, to ensure that there was capacity for offering her this kind of care, but not just her, all of the students in the school, for making that a core value of the school. And so I write 3 chapters about this. The first one is about school design, from first day to last day. The second one is really about the adults in the school. And the third one is really about leadership and advocacy. And so in the school design chapter, I talk about how the school, when you walk into it, I mean, it's a small school, it's one hallway, actually, the cover of the book is the first thing you see when you walk into the school. It's a mural that students painted with a local artist. And ninth and 10th graders are cohorted in teams, interdisciplinary teams. So you have students coming into the school and traveling from class to class with the same group of kids for 2 years and the same group of teachers for 2 years. So there's lots of academic literature that talks about cohorting and looping and the advantages and disadvantages of it. But one of the things that's clear is that when you have cohorts, like you have in elementary school, for example, it allows for trust and trust building more quickly because students know each other well and students know their teachers well. So it's a simple kind of structural thing that allows for kids to start to feel safe, seen, and like they belong in schools really, really quickly. It also allows teachers to develop relationships with one another to support those kids. So there's constant conversations about how kids are doing. And then, of course, in addition to that, there's a strong counseling team support. When you walk into the school, there's no desks. Like you won't find the kids who are learning English or who are the emerging, English learners or whatever in iPads in the corner. What you'll see is tables and all of the kids working at tables in 9th and 10th grade groups. Right. So there's like a 10th grade Spanish speaker with a 9th grade Spanish speaker, and there's a 10th grade Mandarin speaker with a 9th grade Mandarin speaker, and they're all working on a project together where the lingua franca is English. So they might be reading and researching in home language and then producing a project over time in English. And so it's a real fluid process of learning, but it's really built on the international's instructional model, but also in that students feel like they can take risks and that they can try new things, and that the person sitting next to them has been through what they've been through or will move into the role that they will be in, right? It's a very shared kind of responsibility around that. And then in terms of the teachers, I think this is a really important one because so often I am doing another study where I'm interviewing, doing kind of life histories or oral histories with teachers who have or have had DACA and are mid-career. So they've been working in schools for over 5 years. And so many of them talk to me about their isolation as well, how they're brought in to be representative of the immigrant teacher, and then they're the only teacher who's ever being undocumented, and then are kind of tasked with the invisible emotional labor of being the person in the school for immigrant families and for immigrant students, particularly undocumented students. And the result is often burnout and resentment and exhaustion. And in this school, when everybody has some connection to the immigrant community, where there's multiple teachers who have experienced the process of crossing borders for educational purposes or have had the experience of being undocumented and can speak to that, you don't see that. You don't get that kind of isolation. And not only that, but because the school works so hard on teacher retention, teachers are there for a long time. And when new teachers come in and they have to relearn to teach using project-based learning, when they have to relearn to teach English learners, but through a different kind of orientation or lens, the support lasts for many years. So I watch teachers who are in their 4th, 5th, 6th year of teaching still getting really intense mentorship and support as they learned their craft. And so I think, these things are all in concert with one another. One thing can't exist without the other, and they're built over time. But they're not rocket science either, right? Like they're not totally novel concepts. A lot of us talk about project-based learning and professional learning communities and all of these kind of educational words that we use to describe what I'm trying to capture in this book, that this school is doing so well and all at the same time.
Some people might, especially educators or education administrators who are very tired and overworked and they have a million things in their hands, might think, well, sounds like I need to either have more resources because we can barely make it with what we got, or have the ability to reshuffle all of the resources, change the way we do things. But that's easier said than done because we have everything from rules to laws to CBAs, you name it, or culture, even within the communities and within the schools. So, but I'm thinking about the schools are already losing a lot of resources, even the schools that could manage to use this or use their existing resources in order to protect their students right now. And we will be losing more. So our capacity will become less and less. We will probably have the ability to hire less teachers. We will lose some of the programs that would count as innovation in this case. In the Winooski School District, for example, we have full-time district liaisons whose job is to connect language communities to the schools all day, every day. We might be losing money for that, So these are very real things that are happening and will continue to happen because our resources are under threat, and that's on purpose. So there might be a time when we have to ask ourselves, what's left? And what's left might just be a few people standing in our schools. How are we still a sanctuary after all of that has happened?
That is an incredibly important question. One of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did is because this is not a guide, like this is not a playbook, right? It is the last chapter really focuses on mindsets. And yes, schools are going to have less resources. This is going to get worse. But there's also less oversight. And if you can think about that in from a place of resistance and subversiveness, that also weirdly offers an opportunity for innovation. These schools grew out of a moment of great support, and they move in and out of moments where more innovation is possible and when less innovation is possible. The last chapter, this book was written before this current election, or this last election that gave us our current administration. And Shannon can attest to this. The last chapter took probably longer than the rest of the book because I rewrote it 3 times because I was so frustrated about how to offer guidance to schools at this particular moment. And at the same time, that's when I started really, I don't know if you're familiar, but Floyd Bennett Field basically opened in my backyard, which was a tent shelter for migrants who are arriving and being bused from Texas a couple of years ago. And the city was dropping off kids and their families in flip-flops and shorts in the middle of winter in New York City at this place. And I was, thinking a lot about this. What can you do in these really, really horrible moments? And I think I left with 2 main kind of concepts. One, you have to lean on communities. And one of the ways I'm seeing schools doing this is through mutual aid networks, really people close to the ground. So rapid response teams, mutual aid groups that are very, very geographic and locally based. I think schools can lean more on those, as well as the NGOs and community organizations they may already have partners with to do some of this work. And again, you have to build those trusting relationships with partners to be able to do it. But when you can establish those, it offers you the ability to maneuver a little bit. And at least that's what I've seen in the city, in New York City. The second thing is, I think that the educators at the school would argue there's not just a few people in your school. There's one interview I did with the gym teacher at the school, and he was kind of an anomaly to me. He used to be kind of like a finance guy on Wall Street and came back to coach baseball, and he kind of just like looked like a baseball guy. And I don't know, I like saved my interview with him to the end, and we'd only ever kind of like talked sports before. It just like I don't know, I wasn't like feeling like I was going to maybe learn a lot of new things about the school from him. And he set me down, and he was like, every teacher here is a literacy teacher. Every teacher here teaches writing. Every teacher here teaches English. And that really was a kind of moment when I was like, yep, this study's coming to an end. Like, this guy is confirming this finding that I had, which is you aren't working in isolation. You're working on an interdisciplinary team, and all of you have a shared goal, which is creating spaces of belonging for students, allowing them access to rigorous content, and helping them learn English in the process. And so when the gym teacher says to me, I am a literacy teacher, that to me is a socialization and an orientation towards students, towards education, towards sanctuary, that I think is a critical place that all schools can move closer towards. Because in contrast to that, and I'm sure any educator has seen this, the push-in English as a new language teacher is told, you go work with those kids. I'm a science teacher. I'm a math teacher. They're not my responsibility. Bring them back to me when they speak English. And ideologically, I think we see that across the United States, right? We don't think, educators broadly don't think students can learn complicated things until they learn English. And I think that is a real tragedy and something to kind of be excavated and examined. And that's a real reorientation that I think is necessary if you're trying to create more sanctuary spaces for immigrant youth in schools.
Yes, I love that you say that. We have in our school district, we have a long 30-page procedure on how to protect our immigrant students, and one of the pages is dedicated to that very point. So once again, I feel very validated with the work we've been doing, with so many parallels to the work that you've done and your research. But before your book is banned, which I'm sure you're looking forward to, because it would be a badge of honor, it would be right in line with the great minds of our time and the most wonderful people, authors out there. Before that happens, there was a section, and it relates to this last point you made. There was a section in your book that I found very fascinating, where you actually speak to different players around an educational community, from school boards to teachers to students to community members, you name it. Let's pick a couple of those stakeholders, because we might have some listening to us right now or watching this later, and leave us with some very concrete advice about what we should be doing right now, even without the designation of sanctuary. Maybe I'm gonna narrow that down even more. Let's begin with board members. What should they be doing right now? And then we can move down to any other stakeholder group that you choose.
Oh, I was going to avoid that one, the board members question.
No, please don't avoid it.
Okay, here's the thing. I'm going to start kind of umbrella-y and a little meta, but most people in the United States have a fundamental misunderstanding about our immigration system. I mean, the fact that people could be convinced that there were 20 million undocumented people who are criminals in this country is insane, right? It's insane. And by the way, there's only about 11 million undocumented people in the country. So that means you have to create undocumented people. People talk to me all the time about their surprise, their shock and awe when I tell them my family's immigration story, when I talk about what it was like to move from Colombia with my husband, the petitioning, the contact with USCIS, the cost, not just financially, but on our relationship. I mean, immigration is hard, and ours was probably the cheapest and easiest story I've ever heard in all of the work that I've done. People need to fundamentally understand immigration and the way we've failed at immigration. There has been no comprehensive immigration reform in this country since Reagan. There was a little tiny one in 2000, but basically post 9/11, there's been little appetite or conversation about immigration reform. So that's why you hear so many stories of families who are being separated right now after people have spent 20 years of their lives or more. The other thing board members need to know is that children do not have DACA anymore, that there is not a pathway
Yeah.
for high school and college students anymore for work authorization, that we are back to this pre-2012 moment of having kids go through K through 12 schooling, go through college, and have no pathway to work to have a social security number, essentially, right? I think people mostly think about dreamers as young people still. They're like my age, they're like 40,
Mm-hmm.
like a little
Yeah.
younger than, but I ask people when I talk about DACA, what were you doing in 2007? Because you have to have been here since then to have DACA. And most people have lived entire lives by now. And so I think at a very base level, educating yourself about the immigration system, understanding specifically immigration for young people in any district where you're serving immigrant families is crucial. Second of all, the immigrant in your mind doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every immigrant community is mixed status. Every immigrant community has people who are documented, who are underdocumented, and who are undocumented in it. And I think that's really fundamental. Yeah, I guess I would start at those things, and then just politicians in general, which I'll just put board members in that group, need to be talking about immigration reform. It should not be pushed under the rug. None of the things schools are facing will be fixed without comprehensive education reform. And finally, use the word sanctuary in your resolutions if you really want to be part of a movement to making things better for immigrant kids in schools.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate you making that so clear. That was quite a bit of the conversation back and forth here when we officialized it, at least. And I think that speaking to specific stakeholders, especially those in decision-making spaces, is very critical, because there are a lot of people that want to do the right thing, a lot of educators, a lot of community members that want to do the right thing. But instead of finding leaders that will enable and empower the community to do the right thing, they become barriers. And I think that that's the biggest problem we will be facing. And so I appreciate the spirit of that advice and how it's reflected in your book. So thank you so much. I think we have to welcome Shannon back.
Thank you. And I just want to say before you end, thank you so much for the work you're doing. I can theorize about this all I want, but you have chosen to use sanctuary to describe your district. You're doing the work every day. And I'm just very, very grateful for you being here, for walking us through this, and for the work and mission of your district.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Chandler and Wilmer. What a wonderful conversation. So just so that viewers know, you can use the Q&A function at this point to ask any questions for either Chandler or Wilmer. I know and appreciate how busy superintendents are. So, if you have any questions for him, please feel free. And I might just edit as I go through just to make sure we're getting to all of the questions here. I'm going to start, I guess, at the top here. So what are the recommendations or best practices for similar educational contexts worldwide?
This book is I like to think of it as like a very deep story of one school. And what we try to do in anthropological works is make transferable work rather than generalizable. And I really hope that any educator reading this work can see connections to their context. One of the conversations about sanctuary is the way it's used in other places. So if you look at the way it's used in Europe, the way it's used in theology, the way it's used to describe social movements, it kind of morphs and changes. And I hope that the book does the same, that I specifically did not write about best practices, but I wrote about mindsets. And I think those mindsets are applicable in multiple contexts.
Wonderful. Okay, so our next question here is, how did the process for your study go? And did you encounter any major limitations that made you switch gears in the process of your research in any way?
Yeah, so my whole appendix of the book is written for novice researchers. So I'm excited to see that you're Fernanda, that you're here and you're working with Angela Valenzuela. I'm looking at the chat while Shannon's editing. And so I really wrote the appendix for you because after teaching Intro to Urban Ethnography and other methods courses, I realized that getting over some of those initial humps can be really challenging in terms of access, in terms of becoming comfortable, hanging out in a school, interviewing teachers, and people who are asking people who are very busy to spend time with you discussing these things. And so I kind of walk you through what the process looks like. For me, getting site access as a doctoral student was very challenging. And it took a lot of cold calling, a lot of emailing, and a lot of working my network to try to get into the schools. I'm so grateful that I ended up at this particular school. And if I hadn't ended up here, I would have had to really switch gears and rewrite my whole proposal, because I think I had gone through all 15 schools at that point by the time I cold called this school and asked if I could do my dissertation research there. The other thing that I'll just add is that this dissertation was written at a time where I think many of us assumed would be kind of a blip in time. And though no administration has been particularly wonderful for immigrant youth, I'd hoped that the book wouldn't be as relevant as it is today. And so it sat for a long time as my dissertation before Shannon reached out to me, and I think it's set for a couple years after that, because I had kids and it's a pandemic, and I didn't think it was going to be relevant again. And I would say that I wrote it for Juliana. She's Juliana, sorry, I always do that to her. Counselor at one of these schools, and she kept giving my dissertation to new teachers. And I was like, you have to stop doing that. It's so embarrassing. Dissertations are not fun to read for your layperson, and usually have lots of things you don't want to spend your time reading. And so I was like, I've got to get this book out, because otherwise Juliana is just going to send my dissertation to all these new teachers and they're going to think I'm a quack. So I got to make it better. And so Shannon walked me through the process. I joke that I started with 60,000 words and ended with 60,000 words, but they're all different. So yeah, it turned into a book because of because of Shannon, and because of Juliana, and because I really wanted to honor the time and the space that the educators and the students who I write about in this book gave me. And so really it's for them. I'm really hoping it'll be a tool for other educators and novice researchers as well.
Absolutely. So this question, I think, was when we were talking about Milagros, and it says, I'm wondering how schools align sanctuary commitments with mandated reporting when incidents involve immigration-related harm, bias, or abuse.
Oh, yeah, that's hard. And I did a focus group with the whole guidance team around this, and we talked through some really hard stories of when they had to, make difficult calls. There was one story in which a call resulted in a deportation, and the way that they processed that, how it changed their practice after that. I get into this a little bit in the book. And I think, again, the mindsets are helpful with that. Of so much of our lives as educators and school leaders is around compliance, right? We have a lot we have to comply with, and it looks different in every context. And then we have student-centered work, or putting the student first, or whole student work. And oftentimes those things are incongruent. And so when compliance is incongruent with the needs and best interests of students, something has to give, right? And so that's when we talk about, these catch terms of like creative compliance or creative non-compliance. How can you center the student experience and the student need over these things that are rules that we think we have to follow? And I think that orientation to the work, an orientation to question the systems in place, is going to be really important now and continue to be important. And it's really the first mindset I talk about in the conclusion of like, you have to recognize the failures of the states and the fissures in the social contract when you're thinking about compliance. You have to recognize how the systems continue to fail these kids, whether it's because they're undocumented and shouldn't be, or it's because they're given a test that they shouldn't have to take to get a high school diploma. So constantly questioning the systems that exist will position you to better serve marginalized youth broadly, but specifically immigrant kids.
Great, thank you. So,
Do you have anything you want to add to that? Because I feel like you could answer that better than me.
For me? Is that for
Yeah.
me? Sorry,
Just around like compliance and reporting, state mandates, things
yeah,
like that.
I would, yes, I will just say that I'd rather leave it with what you said because it captures the spirit of what I would say. And because of my role as manager, you will have me here talking for the next 5 hours about specific examples on where when we've had to make difficult calls and where we have to rethink our practice. And that is part of what it means to truly be a sanctuary space and team in a way that you are actually committed to making changes, making exceptions, doing what you need to do depending on the context and depending on what is best for the student and the family.
Yeah. There's one part in the book where I write where Laura is told by a bureaucrat, somebody at the district level, like, well, that's just how it is. And she was like, no, that's not how it is.
Yeah.
We make up these rules. We can
Yeah.
decide, what the rules are and if we follow them and how we follow them. So yeah, I think that's about it.
great. And do you have any suggestions on how educators can foster community for our ELL students?
Yeah. There's a book that I talk about in the book a little bit. It's called The Newcomers. I'm blanking on the author right now. But she writes about this kind of singular classroom, this place in which all the newcomers are sent. And I quote from this book that the researcher says one of the roles she was able to play in the classroom is to facilitate the teacher knowing the students. So she was sitting down with translators and interpreters and learning the students' stories, and she would report them back to the teacher to ask them about it. And he would be like, I had no idea. I had no idea that they went through this or that. And so many teachers talk about, I don't have time. I don't have time to know these stories, or I don't want to know these stories because my job is to get them ready for regents. I think one of the first things educators can do is to get to know their students and get to know their stories. Don't be scared of them. There's hard stuff. There's stories you're gonna have to process, but forcing students to live in shadows is not a way to foster community. So build community by making authentic spaces in which children and teenagers can share what they've experienced in their lives.
Was it Helen Thorpe? Was that the author?
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Okay.
And also, hi, Carmen. Thanks for coming.
We'll move on to the next question. So, are there international schools in Florida, particularly Orlando or Miami?
So there's international network schools in New York, DC, LA, and the Bay Area. And there's one that just opened in the Southwest. There are not any in Florida right now, but there are newcomer programs. And there's a lot of newcomer programs across the country. There were more schools like international that were kind of separate school models that kept kids for a long time until No Child Left Behind. A lot of them were not able to stay open because of Bush era policies and accountability policies that existed. So now a lot of newcomer academies exist kind of in the school within a school model. And so I would look out for those. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing in a lot of newcomer programs are places where culture and language is valued, but kids aren't getting access to high quality content. Sometimes they're not getting credits for things that they're doing in school. And oftentimes it serves as kind of like a pre-L program to quickly learn English and then return students to general population. And I think that those are real counters to the things that I'm arguing in this book about what's important in terms of sanctuary spaces for students. So I'll leave you with that and hope you'll investigate more and then report back to me on LinkedIn or something.
Great. And I'm just, hopefully we can get to the last two questions here. So first I want to answer the question about where you can find this book. If you scroll up in the chat, you'll see a 30% off discount code, which you can use to purchase the book on HEP's website. And of course you can look online elsewhere as well, but I would like to just promote that right now. We do have a coupon for the book. So this person was wondering, thoughts on if we should teach students, especially those in migrant communities, to live with the host community, as in to assimilate better, or just have education for a more dignified life and fighting for their rights and identity?
Oh, assimilation is a word that in the academy we struggle with a lot. I don't think the goal is ever really assimilation, because what it has come to mean in the US context is giving up your home language and culture to become the normative, usually kind of white middle class idea of what a community should be. I think communities should be more expansive than that, and we should acknowledge that they're constantly shifting and changing. I think there are other terms that are more appropriate to describe the process that teenagers go through when they've moved from their home country at 12 or 13 and are normal teenagers developing their identity in a new place. So if we don't give it a label and we just talk about what that process is, it is the feeling of being of two places. The cover is actually really about this. The students wrote about this, of that, what it's like to leave your home, what it's like to cross borders, what it's like to go to school and learn a new culture and language. And I really think it's the role of educators and us as a society and as a democracy to continue to think about what we value and who we value and why. And I think immigrants have played an incredible role in creating the society that we all live in now, and have gotten very little credit for it. And so I think instead of talking about assimilation, we should talk about multilingualism and expansive views of what is typical and normal, particularly in school settings.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think that we are at time here. Chandler and Wilmer, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.